This is Group 3's project about the genocide called The Rape of Nanking by Medha Gupta, Abigail Davis, Jordan Hatfield, and Kroisna Chor.
The Rape of Nanking was a genocide conducted by the Japanese military in China. Japanese troops, rapidly expanding into and occupying Chinese territory during the Second Sino-Japanese War, reached the capital on the 13th of December, 1937. Though much of the city's population had evacuated, some civilians and untrained soldiers remained. Over the course of 6 weeks, Japanese soldiers raped, pillaged, and murdered unarmed Chinese in the city. Anywhere from 40,000 to 300,000 Chinese perished. The destruction of records makes exact numbers difficult to verify. This genocide occurred due to a combination of factors, including the perceived genetic superiority of the Japanese, the nationalistic and imperialistic tendencies of the Japanese government, the deep-rooted rivalry between China and Japan, and the military strategy employed by the Japanese during their occupation of China.
Japan and China at war. The Second Sino-Japanese War began with the Japanese invasion of China in 1931 using the Mukden incident as an excuse. The war officially started after the Marco Polo Bridge incident on July 7, 1937, where the Japanese forces wanted access to the town of Wenping because they were looking for one of their troops. A shot went off and both sides began shooting at each other, believing that it was the opposite side who started it. On December 9th, Japan launched a missile strike after failing to get Chinese to surrender, and Japan officially took control of Nanking on December 13th, 1937, a little over 5 months after the war started.
Prior to the siege and subsequent overrunning of Nanking, the Japanese had captured Shanghai. Even earlier, Japanese expansion into Manchuria, northern Chinese land they renamed Manchukuo, caused Sino-Japanese relations to rise and set a precedent of Japanese imperialism.
Chinese resistance in Nanking during the Japanese occupation. The Chinese resistance was called the War of Chinese People's Resistance against Japanese aggression. On December 9, 1937, Japan sent in a missile strike aimed at Nanking as retaliation for the Chinese refusing to surrender. When the Japanese were on their way to Nanking, the government ordered the soldiers to leave, but they didn't mandate an evacuation for the citizens, so a small number of people stayed behind to try and protect the refugees that were mainly the old, sick, and poor who couldn't travel. The Nanking Safety Zone was established by missionaries and other Westerners that lived there, made up of several refugee camps in hopes that the Japanese would not attack them.
The role of foreigners during Japanese control of Nanking. The Westerners that did not flee Nanking joined together to create the International Committee for the Nanking Safety Zone. The German businessman John Ray was elected as the leader due to his position as a member of the Nazi Party and the existence of the German-Japanese Comintern Pact, a pact protecting Germany and Japan from conflict. The committee was not recognized by the Japanese but was still able to protect 250,000 refugees by interfering with Japanese activities. They refused to answer any questions by the Japanese or aid them in any way, and when a Japanese soldier were in Chinese territory, they would follow them to ensure that Chinese civilians were not harmed. Members of this committee later testified and provided evidence in the trials of the Japanese war criminals, helping them get convicted. The organization later reformed to become the International Relief Committee, which continued to do humanitarian work in the Nanking region until 1941. Accountability. The International Military Tribunal for the Far East convened on April 29, 1946 to try 28 Japanese officials consisting of both political and military leaders. All the Japanese officials were convicted and either imprisoned or executed, excluding one scholar who was deemed unfit due to mental illness. The military leaders in charge of the massacre, General Iwane Matsue and Lieutenant General Tani Hisao, were executed. In 2013, former Prime Minister Yukio Hatoyama apologized to China in a speech for the wartime atrocities, emphasizing the Nanking Massacre. There, however, has never been a formal apology from the Japanese government to the Chinese government concerning the Nanking Massacre.
Now let's discuss the history and relationship between China and Japan. From 754 to 1593 AD, there was a significant and long period of history of contact between China and Japan, In the Han Dynasty, Japan mirrored and adopted Chinese customs and traditions. In the Tang Dynasty, Japan adopted Chinese Confucianism. Confucianism is the philosophy and idea that everyone has a common good, and everyone can learn to be better and can learn to improve. In the Ming Dynasty, that's when China started facing actual violent attacks from Japan, where Japanese pirates started to attack Chinese ships because of conflict over Korea, because Japan was trying to invade Korea. In 1868, that marked the time of the Japanese Meiji Restoration. Commodore Perry, who was an American missionary, forced Japan to sign unequal treaties so that they would become more Western and modernize. This meant that they moved from their normal imperialist form of government that China had and moved towards a constitutional monarchy. In 1875, during the late Qing dynasty, Japan invaded Korea for natural resources. This instigated the Sino-Japanese War because, simply put it, China did not want Japanese power in Korea. This meant that Japanese pirates specifically retaliated by targeting Chinese ships because vessels and naval power was the main source of globalization and power at that time. China eventually lost Taiwan and the Liaoning Peninsula, but Russia helped recover the Liaoning Peninsula because they recognized that since Japan was Western-backed, Russia needed to step in to help China. In 1931, this started the Manchurian Rule. Japan expanded from having conquered Korea to conquer Manchuria. This caused rapid Japanese industrialization, and they moved away from coal, iron, and agriculture. This caused a rise of conflict from Chinese warlords who wanted to protect their own country and their own region. But the issue was China wasn't strong enough to retaliate because they had been weakened by the League of Nations. Because the League of Nations was kind of like the United Nations, which was enacted and adopted after World War I, which actually eventually failed. But since China had signed a peace treaty with the League of Nations, they were unable to have any form of violent retaliation against Japan. In 1934, we saw a rise of Chinese resistance against Japan. Russia and China joined as a communist united front to serve against Japanese efforts to create the nation-state of Manchuria. In 1937, that marked the time period of Japanese occupation in China. The Japanese were able to occupy China after attacks near and in Beijing, such as the Marco Polo Bridge, which caused Japan to conquer China and Beijing to fall. This introduced Japanese occupation during World War II, and notably the civil war between communists and nationalists in China. The Chinese nationalists were actually backed by Britain and America because they wanted to fight a war against communism. During this time period, that is also when we saw the rape of Nanking happen by Japanese people in China. There was a significant role of Japanese culture when it came to the rape of Nanking. In the 1930s specifically, the Japanese had a war culture type persona, where basically in the military, during their training as a soldier, their entire life was dependent on the fact that violence was the only way to get work done. And that was a significant ideological and political mobilization of civilians just in general in Japan. This was because there was a general mysticism of the new samurai in the 20th century because people wanted to be aggressive to make their voices heard. The Japanese actually considered humanitarian considerations and anyone making peace or trying to be diplomatic as a sign of weakness. And once they realized that the Chinese were going to give them a fight when they were trying to take over Beijing and when they were trying to take over Korea, they were offended by the fact that the Chinese weren't scared of them. And that is why Japanese culture played a significant role in the rape of Nanking, because Japanese soldiers were extremely offended by the Chinese arrogance, as they put it in historical manuscripts, and therefore they retaliated in a violent form.
Even for those who sheltered in Western embassies, with John Robb, and in the Nanking safety zone, there was no escape from the horrors of the genocide. Even today, the tensions that led up to the rape of Nanking, and especially those that emerged as a result, affect international relations. Though it is safe to say that the society of Japan today is not the same as the one that believed itself superior and cheered on expansion 80 years ago, the memory of war, torture, rape, looting, and murder has touched generations long after 1937 and long past the geographical borders of China and Japan.
And finally, these are our works cited slides. Thank you.